Ethan Gray strolled down the bustling city street, an unusual sight for anyone who knew him. His meticulously planned days rarely left room for such unscheduled moments, and the world outside his office often felt foreign to him. But today, something drew him to the chaos of the urban sprawl. Maybe it was the gnawing feeling of emptiness he couldn't quite name. Despite his wealth, power, and influence, Ethan had been grappling with a vague sense of disconnection, as though he were living someone else's dream. He passed towering glass buildings that mirrored his own, a physical manifestation of his success, and entered the livelier streets. Food vendors shouted their wares. A cacophony of honking cars and chatter filled the air, and the scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with the grime of the city. Ethan felt out of place, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the worn faces around him. As he walked, something caught his eye. A woman sitting on a worn blanket by the sidewalk, her head bowed as she arranged a small display of handmade goods. Around her were 4 children, each no older than 8, busy helping her. One folded scarves, another counted coins in a plastic jar, and the youngest, barely more than a toddler, sat with a small toy in his hands, looking up at passers-by with wide, curious eyes. Ethan's stride faltered. It wasn't the scene itself that stopped him. He'd seen countless people struggling on the streets, a harsh reality he'd long grown accustomed to ignoring. What struck him was the children. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. But the more he looked, the harder it became to deny. Their faces, something about their eyes, their cheekbones, their expressions, felt unnervingly familiar. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped closer, almost unconsciously, his breath catching in his throat. The oldest child, a boy, noticed him first and nudged the woman. She glanced up sharply, her dark eyes meeting Ethan's. For a fleeting second, her expression was blank, but then recognition sparked, and her lips tightened into a thin, bitter line. Ethan froze. He didn't know her, not exactly. Her face was older, weathered by hardship, but there was something disturbingly familiar about her, too. The woman quickly looked away, focusing on arranging the scarves. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Ethan's gaze darted between her and the children. His mind raced as he struggled to place her. Who was she? And why did these children seem to reflect parts of himself, as though they carried his very DNA in their features? "Mom," the oldest boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the street noise. "That man's staring. Just ignore him," she muttered, though her voice betrayed tension. Ethan felt a strange pressure in his chest, an unspoken question forming in his mind, one he didn't know how to ask. Instead, he found himself stepping closer, his shadow falling over the group. The youngest child looked up at him, his big, curious eyes locking onto Ethan's. There was no fear, only an innocent wonder. Ethan opened his mouth to say something. Anything, but no words came out. The woman stood abruptly, blocking his view of the children. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp, defensive. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what he was even doing. "I'm sorry. He glanced at the children again, then back at her. "Do I know you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "No," she said flatly. "You don't?" Her answer felt like a dismissal, but Ethan couldn't walk away. Something about this encounter gnawed at him. He studied her face, searching for a clue. Then it hit him. The memory was faint, buried under years of success and distraction, but it surfaced like a ghost. A younger version of this woman, her face softer, her eyes brighter, laughing with him in a small diner on the edge of town. Sarah. Her name was Sarah. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Sarah?" Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flashed with something between anger and pain. "You've got the wrong person," she said quickly, turning away. "No," Ethan insisted, stepping closer. I knew someone named Sarah. Years ago. You look just like her." The woman scoffed, shaking her head. "You must have me confused with someone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, we're busy." Ethan should have left. She was clearly upset, and lingering felt intrusive, even disrespectful. but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something important, something he couldn't yet understand. He looked at the children again, their faces stirring a deep unease within him. Could it be possible? The thought was absurd, but it rooted itself in his mind and refused to let go. "I'm sorry," he said finally, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to bother you." The woman didn't respond. She crouched down to help the youngest child, her movements hurried and tense. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, then forced himself to turn and walk away. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why did she remind him so much of Sarah? And the children, what was it about them that felt so familiar? As he walked, Ethan couldn't shake the image of their faces. It wasn't just a passing resemblance. It was uncanny. He thought about Sarah, about the last time he'd seen her. It had been over a decade ago, during a time when he was desperate to escape his small-town life. He remembered her telling him she was pregnant, and he remembered the fight that followed. He dismissed her, convinced she was trying to trap him into a life he didn't want. After that, he left town and never looked back. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Could it be possible? Could those children? The thought was too much to process, but it refused to leave him. His mind spun as he replayed the brief encounter in his head, searching for answers. The woman had denied knowing him, but her reaction had been too strong, too personal to be mere coincidence. Ethan stopped walking and looked back over his shoulder. The woman and her children were still there, a small island of vulnerability in the sea of the bustling city. He felt an overwhelming urge to go back, to demand answers, but something held him back. He didn't know what he was afraid of, rejection, guilt, or the truth. But the weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. Instead, he turned and walked away, his mind a storm of confusion and unease. As he made his way back to his sleek car waiting at the curb, one thought echoed louder than the rest. If those children were his, what kind of man had he become to leave them behind? Ethan Gray sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the city skyline. The encounter earlier in the day had unraveled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. His hands rested on the armrest of his leather chair, trembling ever so slightly, though he tried to ignore it. The woman and those children, those 4 children, were etched in his mind. He could still see their faces, especially the youngest with his wide, curious eyes. Ethan closed his own, but the image refused to fade. The resemblance had been unmistakable. It was as though he had been looking at younger versions of himself. The thought was absurd, of course. He had no children. He was certain of that. His relationships over the years had been fleeting, transactional even. No one had ever come close enough to him to leave that kind of mark on his life. Yet, the resemblance haunted him. He thought of the woman, the flash of recognition in her eyes when she looked at him. She had been angry, but beneath the anger, he had sensed something else, a buried pain, an old wound reopened. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His mind wandered back to the name he had uttered earlier, Sarah. He hadn't thought of her in years, not since he left his small hometown to chase success. Sarah had been his first serious girlfriend, back when life was simple and uncomplicated. She had been kind, spirited, and full of life, qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place. But when she told him she was pregnant, everything changed. He remembered the argument vividly, even though he had tried to bury it. She had looked at him with desperation in her eyes, begging him to stay, to take responsibility. But Ethan had been young, restless, and terrified of being trapped. He had accused her of lying, of trying to manipulate him. In his mind, the pregnancy had been her way of tying him down to a life he didn't want. He had left her standing in the pouring rain, her tears blending with the storm, and he hadn't looked back. Now, years later, he wondered if he had been wrong. What if she hadn't been lying? What if she had given birth to his child, or children? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it clung to him like a shadow. He needed answers. Ethan reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name of a private investigator he had used in the past. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. This wasn't like the usual background checks he ordered on potential business partners or competitors. This was personal, deeply personal. But he couldn't let it go. He pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This is Daniel." "Daniel, it's Ethan Gray," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I need your help with something." "Of course, Mr. Gray," Daniel replied. "What's the job?" "It's complicated," Ethan admitted. "I need you to find information on someone. Her name is Sarah, but I don't know her last name anymore. She might have gone by her maiden name. We dated about 10 years ago, back in my hometown. And there's someone else, a woman I saw today. She might be related to Sarah. I'll send you a description and any details I can remember." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Daniel spoke again. "I'll take the case. Send me everything you've got, and I'll start digging." "Thank you," Ethan said, ending the call. He sat back, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew hiring Daniel was the right move, but he couldn't shake the fear of what he might uncover. If those children were his, what did that say about the life he had built? A life of success and wealth, built on the foundation of abandoning someone who might have needed him the most? The days that followed were excruciating. Ethan went about his usual routine, but he was distracted, his mind always drifting back to Sarah and the woman on the street. He avoided social gatherings and ignored calls from business associates, preferring the solitude of his thoughts. His assistant noticed the change in him, but wisely chose not to comment. 3 days later, Daniel called with an update. "Mr. Gray, I've found something," he said, his tone as professional as ever. "You were right. The woman you saw is named Ruth Harper. She's Sarah's mother." Ethan's heart sank. "Her mother?" he repeated, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "I also found records on Sarah. She passed away 8 years ago." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. Sarah was dead. The vibrant, laughing girl he had once known was gone. A wave of guilt crashed over him, almost suffocating in its intensity. What happened to her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She died of a sudden illness," Daniel replied. "Pneumonia, according to the medical records. She left behind 4 children, quadruplets, born shortly after you left town. Ruth Harper has been raising them ever since." Ethan couldn't breathe. The room felt stifling, the walls closing in around him. For children. His children. He didn't need a DNA test to know it was true. The resemblance had been too strong, the timelines aligning perfectly. He had walked away from Sarah without a second thought, and now 4 innocent lives had paid the price for his selfishness. "Thank you, Daniel," he managed to say, his voice hollow. "That will be all." He ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? He had spent years building an empire, convincing himself that he was a man of power and control. But now, faced with the consequences of his past, he felt powerless. Ethan thought about Ruth and the burden she must have carried all these years. He had abandoned Sarah, but Ruth had stayed. She had taken on the responsibility he had so easily walked away from. And the children, his children, had grown up without a father, struggling on the fringes of society while he lived in luxury. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering city below. For the first time in years, the view brought him no satisfaction. All the money, all the success, it felt meaningless now. He had thought he could escape his past, but it had found him, forcing him to confront the man he truly was. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to find Ruth and the children again. He had to make things right, even if it was too late for forgiveness. Ethan Gray sat in his car, parked across the street from the same busy corner where he had first seen Ruth and the children. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale from the pressure. For the past half hour, he had been debating with himself, trying to muster the courage to step out and confront the woman who, he now knew, was Sarah's mother, his children's grandmother. The weight of what he had learned from the private investigator felt almost unbearable, yet he couldn't ignore it. He owed these people something, perhaps everything. Through the windshield, he could see Ruth at her makeshift stall, arranging the scarves and trinkets she was trying to sell. The children moved around her, helping as best they could. The oldest boy seemed to be taking charge, organizing items while casting protective glances at his siblings. Ethan's heart ached at the sight. They were so young, yet seemed so accustomed to hardship. And the resemblance. He saw himself in every movement they made, every expression that crossed their faces. Finally, he exhaled sharply and pushed open the car door. The noise of the street hit him like a wave, jarring after the cocoon of silence in his luxury vehicle. He crossed the street, his steps purposeful but hesitant. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say, but he knew he had to say something. As he approached, Ruth looked up and saw him. Her expression darkened immediately. She straightened, her posture defensive, and stepped in front of the children as if shielding them from an unseen threat. The oldest boy noticed her reaction and turned to see Ethan. His face hardened, mimicking Ruth's protective stance. "You again," Ruth said sharply, her voice cutting through the street noise. "What do you want?" Ethan stopped a few feet away, unsure how to begin. He could feel the children's eyes on him, their curiosity mingled with wariness. His gaze flickered to them, and he felt a pang of guilt so deep it almost knocked the breath out of him. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. I need to talk to you. Please." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "We don't have anything to talk about." "Please," he repeated, his tone more insistent this time. "I know who you are, and I think you know who I am." Her face twisted with anger. "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Ethan Gray," she snapped. "You're the man who walked away from my daughter when she needed you the most. The man who abandoned her when she was carrying your children." The words hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? She was right. He had walked away. He had abandoned Sarah. "Ruth," he began, but she cut him off. "You don't get to say her name," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't deserve to." The children were watching the exchange with wide eyes, their confusion evident. The oldest boy stepped closer to Ruth, his hand clutching her arm. "Mom, who is this man?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Ruth hesitated, her gaze flickering to the boy. She seemed torn, as though deciding whether to shield them from the truth or lay it bare. Finally, she looked back at Ethan, her eyes blazing. "This man," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "is the reason your mother had to struggle alone. The reason she's not here today." Ethan flinched at her words. "That's not fair," he said softly. I didn't know she... Didn't know what?" Ruth interrupted, her voice rising. "That she was pregnant? That she was carrying your children? You knew. You just didn't care." The accusation stung, and Ethan felt a swell of shame rise in his chest. She was right, of course. At the time, he hadn't cared. He had been so focused on his own dreams, his own escape, that he had dismissed Sarah's pleas as manipulation. "I was young," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I was scared. I didn't know how to handle it. But I didn't know about the children. I swear I didn't." Ruth shook her head, her expression hard. "And what difference would it have made if you had? Would you have come back? Would you have been a father to them? Or would you have run off just the same?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He wanted to say that he would have stayed, that he would have done the right thing, but he couldn't lie. The truth was he didn't know what he would have done. He wasn't the man then that he was now, and even now, he wasn't sure he was ready to take on the responsibility. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I'm here now, and I want to make things right." Ruth laughed bitterly. "Make things right? How exactly? With your money? Your fancy cars? Do you think throwing some cash at us will erase what you did?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "That's not what I mean. I want to help. I wanted to be there for them. For you." Her eyes narrowed again. "Why now? After all these years, why now? Because you happen to see us on the street? Because you feel guilty?" "Maybe," Ethan admitted. "I don't know, but I can't walk away again. I can't." Ruth stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to the children. "Go inside," she said, her tone firm but gentle. "Now." The children hesitated, their eyes darting between Ruth and Ethan. The oldest boy seemed reluctant to leave her side, but she gave him a stern look, and he relented. Slowly, the children disappeared into a nearby doorway, leaving Ruth and Ethan alone. When they were gone, Ruth turned back to him. "Do you have any idea what you left behind?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Any idea what my daughter went through? She worked herself to the bone to provide for those kids. And when she got sick, she didn't even tell anyone because she couldn't afford to stop working. By the time we realized how bad it was too late. She died, Ethan. She died. Her words hit him like a sledgehammer, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He felt the full weight of his actions, or inactions, crushing him. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know. If I had known." "Stop," Ruth said, holding up a hand. "Don't. Sorry doesn't fix anything. It doesn't bring her back." Ethan swallowed hard. "I know it doesn't, but I want to help. I want to be there for the kids. I want to be a father to them." Ruth laughed again, a harsh, hollow sound. "A father? You think you can just walk in here after all this time and play father? They don't even know you." "Then let me get to know them," he said, his voice firm. "Please, let me try." Ruth stared at him, her expression softening just slightly. For the first time, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the years of struggle etched into her face. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched between them. Finally, she sighed. "If you're serious about this, if you really mean it, you have to prove it. Words don't mean anything to me, Ethan. Actions do." "I will," he promised. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Ruth nodded slowly, though the doubt in her eyes remained. "We'll see," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone on the crowded street, his heart heavy with the enormity of what lay ahead. Ethan Gray sat alone in the dim light of his study, the city skyline sprawling out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view, once a source of pride and comfort, now felt empty. His world, meticulously built on wealth and success, seemed to be crumbling under the weight of his own past. Ruth's words echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. "You think you can just walk in here after all this time and play father?" The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unyielding. Every detail of what Ruth had told him painted a picture of Sarah's life after he left. A life of hardship, sacrifice, and pain. He could imagine her working tirelessly, juggling the demands of motherhood and her own survival. And he hadn't been there. Worse, he hadn't even cared enough to look back. Ethan reached for his glass of scotch and took a sip, the liquid burning his throat, but doing nothing to dull the ache in his chest. His reflection in the glass of the window stared back at him, hollow and unrecognizable. Was this who he was? A man who had walked away from his responsibilities, leaving others to clean up the mess he had made? He set the glass down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands covering his face. His mind raced with questions. How could he ever make this right? Did he even deserve a second chance? He thought of the children, their wide, questioning eyes, the subtle wariness in their gazes. They didn't know who he was, but they had sensed something. In Ruth's bitterness, her fierce protectiveness, it wasn't unwarranted. She had been there for them when he wasn't. She had earned the right to guard them from him. For years, Ethan had convinced himself that his choices back then had been justified. He had been young, scared, and desperate to escape the suffocating confines of his small-town life. The idea of being tied down, of giving up his ambitions to raise a child, had terrified him. But now, in the cold light of his penthouse, those justifications felt hollow. They weren't excuses, they were cowardice. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but intertwined with it was doubt. Could he really do this? Could he step into a role he had so carelessly abandoned? He had no experience with children, no idea how to be a father. His life revolved around boardrooms, investments, and high-stakes deals. What did he know about bedtime stories, scraped knees, or helping with homework? What if he failed? What if he hurt them more by trying to be part of their lives? The buzzing of his phone broke through his spiraling thoughts. He reached for it and saw the name of his assistant, Maya, on the screen. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but then he sighed and answered. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Gray," Maya began, her tone cautious. "I just wanted to let you know that the board meeting tomorrow has been rescheduled. Also, there's a charity gala this weekend. They're expecting you to speak." Ethan closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. Normally, he would have been focused on these events, meticulously planning his appearances and speeches. But now, they felt like distractions from something far more important. "Cancel my attendance at the gala," he said abruptly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Cancel? Sir, this is one of the biggest events of the year." I said cancel it," Ethan repeated, his voice firmer. "I have more pressing matters to attend to." Another pause. Then Maya replied, "Understood. Is there anything else?" "No," he said, and ended the call before she could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, feeling a pang of guilt for snapping at Maya. She had done nothing wrong. She was just doing her job. But the frustration within him had no outlet, and it was starting to seep into everything he did. He stood and paced the room, the silence of the penthouse pressing in around him. His mind kept returning to Sarah. He tried to picture her during those years he had been absent, but all he could see was the younger version of her, the vibrant, laughing woman he had once loved. He tried to reconcile that image with the stories Ruth had told him, but it felt impossible. Ethan stopped at his desk, pulling open a drawer and retrieving an old photograph. It was the only picture he had of Sarah, taken during a summer trip when they were still young and carefree. She was sitting by the edge of a lake, her hair wild in the wind, her smile bright and full of life. He ran his thumb over the image, his chest tightening. She had deserved better than what he had given her. The children's faces surfaced in his mind again, and he felt another wave of guilt. They were strangers to him, yet they were his blood. They had grown up without a father because of his choices. What kind of impact had that left on them? Were they bitter like Ruth? Did they resent the absence of a father they never knew? Or had they simply accepted it, adapting to a life where he didn't exist? Ethan sank back into his chair, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to make things right, but he didn't even know where to begin. Money had always been his solution to problems, but Ruth had made it clear that money wasn't enough. And she was right. These weren't strangers he could appease with a check. These were his children, and if he wanted to be part of their lives, he needed to prove that he was more than just a wealthy man with good intentions. But what if Ruth was right to doubt him? What if he wasn't capable of being the father they needed? The doubt clawed at him, feeding on his insecurities. He had spent so long focused on himself, on his ambitions. He didn't know how to be selfless, how to put someone else's needs above his own. And yet, the thought of walking away again felt unbearable. He couldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. He couldn't abandon them a second time. The sound of laughter drifted up from the street below, faint but distinct. Ethan rose and moved to the window, looking down at the world below. A family was walking along the sidewalk, the parents holding hands with their children as they strolled. The sight stirred something in him, an ache he didn't fully understand. He had never wanted a family before, had never even considered it. But now, faced with the reality of the one he had unknowingly created, he felt an overwhelming desire to try. The guilt and doubt would never disappear entirely. He knew that. But maybe they didn't have to. Maybe they could serve as a reminder of what was at stake, of what he had to fight for. He thought of Ruth's parting words, her challenge to prove himself through actions, not words. For the first time in years, Ethan felt uncertain about the road ahead. But beneath the uncertainty, there was determination. He couldn't undo the past, but he could decide what kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. And for the sake of Sarah's memory, for the sake of those children, he would try. He owed them that much, at least. Ethan stood outside Ruth's small apartment building, clutching a grocery bag in one hand and a box of art supplies in the other. It was a modest building, its brick facade worn and weathered by years of neglect. The neighborhood was a far cry from the luxury Ethan was accustomed to, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the daunting task ahead, his first attempt at reconnecting with the children. After their confrontation, Ruth had reluctantly agreed to let him visit, though her skepticism was palpable. Her conditions were clear: no empty promises, no quick fixes, and no overwhelming the children. If Ethan wanted to be part of their lives, he had to prove himself worthy. He had spent the past week preparing, agonizing over how to approach the situation. What did he know about children? What could he possibly say or do to bridge the chasm of time and absence? The sound of laughter floated down from one of the upper floors, and Ethan's chest tightened. He took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, the weight of his guilt and nerves pressing down on him. When he reached the door, He hesitated before knocking. The sound echoed in the hallway, followed by a brief silence. Then, the door creaked open, and Ruth stood before him, her expression guarded. "You're early," she said, her tone neutral. "I figured it was better than being late," Ethan replied, managing a faint smile. Ruth eyed the bags he was holding. "What's all that?" "Groceries," he said, lifting the bags slightly. "And some art supplies for the kids. I thought." He trailed off, unsure if his gesture would be welcomed or seen as overstepping. Ruth gave him a long, appraising look before stepping aside. "Come in." Ethan entered the apartment, his eyes immediately taking in the cramped but tidy space. The walls were adorned with mismatched frames holding family photos and the children's drawings. It was a home built on love and resilience, despite its modesty. The children were gathered in the small living room. The oldest boy, Jacob, stood protectively in front of his siblings, his expression wary. Beside him was Ava, her bright eyes flickering with curiosity, though she tried to hide it. Liam, the quiet one, clung to a worn stuffed animal, his gaze darting nervously between Ethan and Ruth. The youngest, Ella, peeked out from behind Jacob, her small hands clutching his shirt. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of their gazes making his throat tighten. He felt like an intruder in their world, a stranger who didn't belong. But he forced himself to speak. "Hi," he said, his voice gentle. "It's nice to see you all again." The children didn't respond, their expressions ranging from cautious to indifferent. Ethan set the bags down on the kitchen counter and turned back to them, feeling the awkwardness stretch between them like an invisible barrier. "I brought some things for you," he said, reaching for the box of art supplies. "I heard you like to draw, so I thought these might come in handy." Ava's eyes lit up for a moment, but she quickly glanced at Jacob, as if seeking permission to react. Jacob folded his arms, his jaw tight. "Why are you here?" he asked bluntly, his voice steady despite the tension in it. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I'm here because I want to get to know you," he said honestly. "I know I haven't been around, and I can't change that. But I'd like to try to be here now. If you'll let me." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "Why now? Where were you when Mom needed you?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but found that no words could adequately address the pain in Jacob's voice. "I don't have a good answer for that," he admitted finally. "I made mistakes, big ones, and I can't undo them. But I'm here now because I care about you. All of you." Jacob didn't look convinced. Ava, however, stepped forward hesitantly, her gaze fixed on the box of art supplies. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan knelt down and opened the box, revealing a colorful assortment of markers, sketch pads, and paints. Ava's face softened, and she inched closer. "These are for us?" she asked, a hint of excitement breaking through her guarded demeanor. Ethan smiled. "They're all yours. I heard you're quite the artist." Ava glanced at Jacob again, but this time, she didn't wait for his approval. She reached into the box and pulled out a sketch pad, flipping through the blank pages with wide eyes. Liam and Ella crept closer, drawn by their sister's enthusiasm. "Can we use them now?" Ava asked, looking up at Ruth. Ruth hesitated, her eyes flicking to Ethan. After a moment, she nodded. "Go ahead." The younger children gathered around Ava as she began organizing the supplies, their initial wariness replaced by excitement. Jacob, however, remained where he was, his arms still crossed. He watched Ethan with a mixture of suspicion and defiance. Ethan turned to him, his tone quiet but sincere. "Jacob, I know this is hard for you. I can't expect you to trust me right away. But I want to earn your trust, however long that takes." Jacob didn't respond, but his expression flickered with something, perhaps a faint crack in his armor. He turned and joined his siblings, sitting cross-legged on the floor as Ava handed out sketch pads and markers. Ethan watched them for a moment, a small sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The rest of the visit was a careful balancing act. Ethan helped Ruth in the kitchen, unpacking the groceries and preparing a simple lunch for the kids. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be part of such an ordinary routine. He wasn't sure if he was doing too much or too little, but Ruth didn't stop him, and the children seemed to relax slightly as the day went on. After lunch, Ethan sat with the children as they drew, making small comments and asking questions about their creations. Ava warmed up to him quickly, showing him her drawings and explaining her ideas with enthusiasm. Liam and Ella followed her lead, their shyness gradually fading. Jacob, however, remained distant, his walls firmly in place. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself marveling at the children's resilience. Despite everything they had been through, they were bright, creative, and full of potential. He couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility and an equally overwhelming sense of regret. When it was time to leave, Ethan stood by the door, his heart heavy. "Thank you for letting me visit," he said to Ruth, his voice earnest. "I know this isn't easy, but I appreciate it." Ruth nodded, her expression unreadable. "We'll see how serious you are," she said, her tone carrying a hint of challenge. Ethan glanced at the children. "I'll be back soon," he said, meeting Jacob's gaze. "If that's okay." Jacob didn't respond, but Ava smiled and waved. "Bring more paper next time," she called. Ethan chuckled softly. "You got it?" As he left the apartment and stepped into the cool evening air, Ethan felt a mix of emotions: hope, guilt, and the weight of the road ahead. The first steps were behind him, but the journey had only just begun. Over the following weeks, Ethan visited Ruth and the children regularly, carefully navigating the fragile boundaries of their trust. Each visit was a delicate balance of presence and restraint, showing up without overwhelming them, offering help without imposing, and slowly, steadily becoming a part of their lives. The children, hesitant at first, began to warm to him in small but meaningful ways. Ava was the first to let her guard down completely. Her love for art became a bridge between them. Ethan made sure to bring more supplies on his visits: colorful paints, brushes, and high-quality sketch pads. One afternoon, he surprised her with a book about famous artists and their techniques. Her eyes lit up as she flipped through the pages, her enthusiasm bubbling over as she pointed out her favorite styles. "Do you paint too?" Ava asked one day as they sat at the small kitchen table, her hands smudged with green and blue paint. Ethan chuckled. "Not really. I wasn't very good at it when I tried, but I'd love to learn if you'd teach me." Ava grinned, a wide, uninhibited smile that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Okay," she said, dipping her brush into a cup of water. "But you have to practice a lot." "I'll do my best," Ethan promised. While Ava's trust grew quickly, Liam and Ella were more reserved. Liam rarely spoke, often watching from the sidelines as his siblings interacted with Ethan. Ella, on the other hand, was curious but shy. She would hover near him, her big eyes studying him as though trying to piece together who he really was. Ethan didn't push them, choosing instead to be patient and consistent. He would sit on the floor with them, helping Ava sort through her art supplies or playing simple games Ruth had taught them. Gradually, Liam started to join in, quietly handing Ethan blocks or offering a shy smile when Ethan praised something he built. Ella began climbing into his lap during story time, her small hands clutching his shirt as she leaned against him. The moments were small but profound. Ethan found himself cherishing every smile, every laugh, every shared glance. It wasn't easy. Building trust never was, but it was rewarding in ways he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, he felt something real, something that filled the emptiness he hadn't even realized was there. Jacob, however, remained a challenge. The oldest of the siblings, he carried the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. Ethan could see it in the way Jacob always positioned himself protectively between his siblings and the world, in the way he watched every move Ethan made with a mix of skepticism and defiance. One evening, as the younger children worked on a puzzle in the living room, Ethan found Jacob sitting alone on the small balcony. He hesitated before stepping outside, unsure if his presence would be welcome. Jacob didn't look up, his attention focused on the skyline. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan asked cautiously. Jacob shrugged, but didn't tell him to leave. So Ethan sat down on the edge of the worn plastic chair next to him. For a moment, they sat in silence, the distant hum of traffic filling the air. "You don't have to keep coming here, you know?" Jacob said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan looked at him, surprised by the comment. Why would you say that? Jacob shrugged again, his hands resting on his knees. Because we don't need you. We've been fine without you. The words stung, but Ethan nodded slowly, understanding where they came from. You're right, he said. You've been doing an amazing job. You take care of your brother and sisters better than most adults could. And Ruth, your grandma, she's incredible. Jacob finally looked at him, his eyes narrowing. So why are you here then? Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because I made a mistake a long time ago. A big one. And I don't want to make another by staying away. I know I wasn't there for you before, but I'm here now. And I want to help, if you'll let me. Jacob frowned, his jaw tightening. What happens when you get bored? When this isn't fun for you anymore? Are you just going to disappear again? The question hit Ethan hard. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I can't change the past, he said honestly. I wish I could, but I can't. All I can do is prove to you, day by day, that I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to believe me right now. I know I have to earn that. Jacob stared at him for a long moment before looking away, his expression unreadable. We'll see, he muttered, standing and walking back inside. Ethan stayed on the balcony, letting the cool evening air wash over him. Jacob's words echoed in his mind, a stark reminder of the damage his absence had caused. But he didn't feel discouraged. The fact that Jacob had opened up, even a little, was progress. As the weeks turned into months, the bonds between Ethan and the children grew stronger. He began to join them in their routines, helping with homework, attending school events, and even cooking dinner on occasion, though his culinary skills left much to be desired. Ruth, still watchful, gradually allowed him more access to their lives, though she never stopped reminding him that trust had to be earned. One afternoon, Ethan picked the children up from school for the first time. It was a small milestone, but it felt monumental to him. He stood outside the school gates, watching as Ava and Ella ran toward him, their backpacks bouncing against their small frames. Liam followed more slowly, his hand gripping Jacob's as they approached. Did you bring snacks? Ava asked, her eyes bright. Ethan grinned and held up a bag of apples and granola bars. I come prepared. Ella giggled and reached for an apple, while Jacob hung back, his expression guarded as always. But when Ethan handed him a granola bar, Jacob took it without hesitation. A small victory that filled Ethan with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The ride home was filled with chatter, Ava and Ella recounting their day in vivid detail, while Liam nodded along silently. Even Jacob joined in, correcting his sisters when they exaggerated their stories. Ethan listened, laughing at their antics and marveling at how much joy these small moments brought him. By the time they reached home, the children were relaxed and smiling, their earlier wariness forgotten. Ruth met them at the door, her sharp eyes scanning the group as if assessing their well-being. She raised an eyebrow at Ethan, but didn't say anything, a subtle acknowledgement that he was doing something right. That night, as Ethan helped Liam and Ella with their bedtime routine, he felt a profound sense of belonging. For the first time in years, his life felt meaningful. The bonds he was building with the children were fragile, but they were real, and he was determined to nurture them, no matter how long it took. It had been a few months since Ethan had started building relationships with Ruth and the children. The progress was slow but steady, and he found himself deeply invested in their lives. However, just as he was beginning to feel a fragile sense of stability, the unexpected happened. Ruth fell seriously ill. It started with a persistent cough that Ruth brushed off as nothing more than a seasonal cold. She continued her routines, cooking, cleaning, and managing the household with her characteristic resilience. But over the weeks, her condition worsened. Ethan noticed her leaning more heavily on the furniture and pausing to catch her breath during their conversations. The children seemed to notice too, their eyes filled with quiet worry whenever Ruth sat down with her hand pressed against her chest. Ruth, you need to see a doctor, Ethan insisted one evening as she coughed uncontrollably. They were sitting in the small kitchen, the children already asleep. Her face was pale, her movements slower than usual. I don't have time for doctors, Ruth replied stubbornly, her voice hoarse. Who's going to take care of the kids? You. The comment stung, but Ethan didn't back down. Yes, I will, but you need to get checked out, This isn't something you can just push through. Ruth waved him off, clearly uninterested in continuing the discussion. Ethan clenched his fists, frustrated by her refusal to prioritize her health. He knew she was proud, fiercely independent, and used to carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the children and their future. When Ruth collapsed in the middle of preparing dinner one evening, Ethan's fears were realized. He rushed to her side, catching her just before she hit the floor. The children, who had been playing in the living room, ran into the kitchen, their faces pale with fear. "Grandma!" Ava cried, tears welling in her eyes. "It's okay," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm even though his heart was racing. "She just needs to see a doctor. I'll take care of her." Ruth's eyes fluttered open, and she weakly protested. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," Ethan said firmly. "We're going to the hospital." With Jacob's help, Ethan got Ruth into his car and drove to the emergency room. The ride was tense, the children huddled in the back seat, whispering to each other. Jacob sat silently, his expression hard as he stared out the window. At the hospital, doctors quickly took Ruth in for tests. Hours passed as Ethan paced the waiting room, the children sitting quietly nearby. Ava clung to Liam, her face buried in his shoulder, while Ella dozed off in Jacob's lap. Jacob's face remained impassive, but Ethan could see the worry in his eyes. When the doctor finally emerged, Ethan braced himself. "How is she?" he asked. "She's stable for now," the doctor said, his tone measured. "But she has pneumonia, and it's advanced. She'll need to stay here for a while to recover. It's a good thing you brought her in when you did." Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. But it was short-lived. The reality of Ruth's condition hit him like a brick. She wouldn't be able to care for the children while she recovered, and the responsibility would fall entirely on him. The next few weeks were some of the most challenging of Ethan's life. Ruth was confined to the hospital, and Ethan had to step up in ways he had never imagined. He moved into Ruth's apartment temporarily, sleeping on the worn couch and juggling the demands of raising 4 children. Mornings were a whirlwind of chaos as he tried to get the kids ready for school. Ava would refuse to wear anything that didn't match her carefully curated outfits. Liam would misplace his shoes, and Ella would cling to Ethan, refusing to let him leave her side. Jacob, as usual, took on the role of mini-adult, helping where he could, but clearly resentful of Ethan's sudden presence in their daily lives. "You don't have to do this," Jacob said one morning as Ethan struggled to pack their lunches. "We've been fine without you before. We can manage." Ethan paused, looking at the boy who was far too grown up for his age. "It's not about whether you can manage, Jacob," he said softly. "It's about making sure you don't have to do it alone." Jacob didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Afternoons were equally hectic. Ethan picked the children up from school, helped them with homework, and tried to cook dinners that didn't end in disaster. The children were patient with his lack of culinary skills, though Ava wasn't shy about critiquing his attempts at making macaroni and cheese. "This doesn't taste like Grandma's," she said, wrinkling her nose. "I'm sure it doesn't," Ethan replied with a laugh. "But at least it's edible, right?" Ava giggled, and even Liam cracked a smile. Jacob, however, remained aloof, his walls firmly in place. One evening, as Ethan sat in the living room, exhausted from the day, he overheard Jacob talking to Ava and Liam in their shared bedroom. "Why is he even here?" Jacob whispered. "He left, Mom. He didn't care about us then. So why does he care now?" Ava's voice was quieter, hesitant. "Maybe he's trying to make up for it." Jacob scoffed. "You don't just make up for something like that." Ethan leaned back against the wall, the words cutting deep. Jacob was right. He couldn't erase the past. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't undo the years of absence. But he could be here now, and he would do everything in his power to prove to Jacob, and to all of them, that he wasn't going anywhere. Ruth's absence also brought unexpected challenges to Ethan's professional life. His business partners grew frustrated with his lack of availability, and whispers began circulating about his priorities shifting. Ethan found himself in tense phone calls late at night, trying to balance the demands of his career with the new responsibilities he had taken on. "You can't keep splitting your focus like this, Ethan," one of his partners said during a heated call. The company needs you. This, whatever this is, it's distracting you. It's not a distraction, Ethan replied firmly. It's my family. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before his partner sighed. Just don't let it ruin everything you've built. Ethan ended the call, his frustration simmering. For years, he had poured everything into his business, believing it was the key to his happiness. But now, as he tucked Ella into bed and listened to Ava excitedly recount her day, he realized that his definition of success had changed. It wasn't about wealth or status anymore. It was about the connections he was building, the family he was slowly beginning to feel a part of. When Ruth finally returned home from the hospital, the children were overjoyed. They clung to her, their relief palpable. Ethan watched from the doorway, his chest tight with emotion. Ruth met his gaze, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "You did good," she said quietly, her voice hoarse but warm. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he felt stronger, more determined than ever. Ruth's illness had been a turning point, not just for her, but for all of them. It had forced Ethan to step into a role he had spent years avoiding. And though the journey had been difficult, it had also been deeply rewarding. He wasn't just a visitor in their lives anymore. He was part of the family, and he wasn't going to let them down again. Ruth's return home from the hospital marked a pivotal moment in Ethan's journey with the family. The weeks he had spent caring for the children while she was recovering had transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had learned their routines, their quirks, and their vulnerabilities. He had also experienced the relentless exhaustion and quiet rewards that came with parenthood. More than anything, he had realized the profound depth of his own desire to stay in their lives. But redemption required more than intention. It required sacrifice. Ethan was acutely aware that his role in their lives wasn't guaranteed. Ruth's skepticism lingered. Jacob's walls remained firmly in place, and the children's futures hung precariously on his ability to prove himself as someone they could rely on. As he sat with Ruth in the small living room one evening, the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on him. "You did well while I was gone," Ruth said, her voice low but steady. Her sharp eyes studied him, as if she were searching for something beneath the surface. "Thank you," Ethan replied. "But it wasn't just about managing things while you were away. I want to keep being here for them. And for you." Ruth sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Words are easy, Ethan. Promises, even easier. I've been around long enough to know that actions are what matter. You've taken a few good steps, but this isn't a sprint. It's a marathon. Are you ready for that?" Ethan nodded, though he felt the full weight of her words. "I know I can't undo the past, but I'm not walking away again. Not now, not ever." Her eyes softened slightly, and she nodded. "Then we'll see." Ethan's determination to earn the family's trust collided with the reality of his professional life. The demands of his business were unrelenting, and his sudden shift in priorities was causing ripples that threatened to become waves. Investors grew restless, questioning his dedication. His business partners were vocal in their frustration, and Ethan found himself caught in tense boardroom meetings where every decision seemed to magnify the growing rift between him and his team. One particular meeting escalated into a confrontation. His partner, Andrew, leaned across the conference table, his tone sharp. "Ethan, we've backed you through everything, the expansion, the riskier ventures, but now it feels like you're not even here. What's going on with you?" Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. "I'm still committed to this company. I'm handling things on the ground. Are you?" Andrew shot back. "Because the numbers don't reflect it. You're distracted. Whatever personal issues you're dealing with, they're bleeding into the business. You're risking everything we've built." Ethan took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't reveal the full story. His personal life wasn't something he wanted to use as an excuse, but he also knew the truth. His heart wasn't in the business the way it once was. His priorities had shifted, and the family he was trying to rebuild had become the center of his world. After the meeting, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline. He could feel the walls closing in. He knew he couldn't keep balancing both worlds indefinitely. If he was going to be the father the children deserved, he had to make a choice, a painful one. The decision wasn't easy, but Ethan knew what he had to do. He called an emergency meeting with his partners the next day, standing before them with a calm resolve that surprised even himself. "I've thought long and hard about this," he began, his voice steady. "And I've realized that I can't give this company the attention it deserves anymore. My priorities have shifted, and I need to step back." The room erupted with murmurs and protests. Andrew looked at him in disbelief. "You're stepping down? Ethan, this is your company. You're the face of it. Without you, it will survive," Ethan said firmly. "I've built this company with an incredible team, and I trust you all to keep it thriving. But my focus needs to be elsewhere right now." Andrew shook his head, his frustration evident. "You're making a mistake. You're throwing away everything you've worked for." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "No, I'm choosing something more important." The decision was final. Ethan arranged for a transition plan, handing over the reins to his partners and ensuring that the company would continue without him. It was a bittersweet moment, walking away from something he had poured his life into, but he felt a profound sense of clarity. For the first time, he was choosing family over ambition. With his professional obligations behind him, Ethan devoted himself fully to the children and Ruth. He used the wealth he had accumulated to ensure they had everything they needed: better clothes, healthier meals, and even extracurricular activities for the kids. But he was careful not to let the money overshadow the real work of building their trust. He attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with science projects, and spent long evenings reading bedtime stories to Ella. The moments that had once felt foreign and overwhelming now brought him a quiet sense of fulfillment. He found joy in the small victories, watching Liam open up during a game of catch, seeing Ava proudly display her latest painting, hearing Ella's laughter as he spun her around the room. Even Jacob, though still guarded, began to let his walls down in subtle ways. One evening, as they worked on fixing a broken chair together, Jacob muttered, "You're not as useless as I thought." Ethan laughed, but the comment warmed his heart. "Thanks, I think." Ruth, too, began to soften toward him. She watched his interactions with the children with a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope. One afternoon, as they sat on the balcony while the kids played, she spoke quietly. "I didn't think you'd stick around," she admitted, her gaze distant. "I thought you'd get tired of this and go back to your old life." Ethan looked at her, his expression earnest. "I'm not that person anymore, Ruth. They've changed me." She nodded slowly. "I see that. And so do they." Even Jacob, though he won't admit it. Ethan smiled, a small sense of relief washing over him. Ruth's approval meant more to him than he had realized. The ultimate test of Ethan's commitment came when Ruth suggested he take legal steps to secure his role in the children's lives. She explained that while she would always be there for them, she wasn't getting any younger and the children needed stability. "If something happens to me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "they need to know they have someone who will fight for them." Ethan's heart ached at the thought of Ruth not being there, but he understood the importance of her words. He began the process of legally adopting the children, a move that brought both joy and uncertainty. The legal proceedings were complex, with questions about his past and his ability to provide for them. But Ethan faced each challenge head-on, determined to prove that he was ready to be the father they deserved. The day the adoption was finalized, Ruth and the children surprised him with a small celebration at home. Ava had painted a banner that read, "Welcome to the family, Dad." Liam and Ella had baked a lopsided cake with Ruth's help, and even Jacob had contributed by fixing a broken chair so they would have enough seats at the table. As Ethan looked around at their smiling faces, his heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. This was his family, messy, imperfect, and full of love, and he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The day after the adoption was finalized, Ethan woke up to an unfamiliar feeling: peace. For months, he had been walking a tightrope, balancing the guilt of his past with the determination to build a future with the family he had once abandoned. But now, as the morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Ruth's small apartment, he felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. The papers might have made it official, but the bonds he had worked so hard to form had already taken root in their hearts. Still, he knew that forgiveness, true forgiveness, wasn't something that came easily or automatically. It had to be earned, and even after everything, there were still wounds that needed healing. Ethan found Ruth in the kitchen, sipping her morning tea as she flipped through an old photo album. She looked up when he entered, her sharp eyes softening for a moment before she gestured for him to sit down. He hesitated, then joined her at the table. "These were Sarah's," Ruth said, her voice tinged with nostalgia as she turned a page. The photos were faded, but they captured moments of Sarah's life that Ethan had never known. Her high school graduation, a family picnic, a candid shot of her laughing with friends. Ethan's throat tightened as he reached out to touch one of the photos. "She looks so happy," he said softly. "She was," Ruth replied, her tone bittersweet. "Even after you left, she tried to find joy in what she had. Those kids gave her a reason to keep going, even when things got hard." The word struck Ethan like a hammer. He looked at Ruth, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she would have forgiven me for what I did?" Ruth set down her cup, her expression unreadable. "Sarah had a big heart. She might have forgiven you eventually, but it wouldn't have been easy. You hurt her deeply, Ethan. She loved you, and when you left, it broke something in her." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he admitted. "Not from her, not from you, and not from the kids. But I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to them." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Forgiveness isn't about whether you deserve it. It's about whether the people you've hurt are willing to let go of the pain you caused. And that takes time." Ethan looked down at his hands, nodding slowly. He knew Ruth was right. Forgiveness couldn't be rushed or forced. It had to come naturally, when the wounds had finally started to heal. That afternoon, Ethan took the kids to the park. It had become a regular outing for them, a way to unwind and spend time together. Ava immediately ran to the swings, challenging Liam and Ella to see who could go the highest. Jacob hung back, as usual, sitting on a bench with his arms crossed. Ethan joined him, sitting a few feet away. For a while, they watched the younger kids play, the sound of their laughter filling the air. "You don't have to try so hard, you know," Jacob said suddenly, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an edge of weariness. Ethan turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Jacob shrugged. "All the stuff you've been doing. The visits, the gifts, the adoption. It's like you're trying to fix everything all at once. But it doesn't work like that." Ethan nodded, appreciating the boy's honesty. "You're right. It doesn't. And I know I can't fix the past. Jacob, I wish I could. But all I can do is try to be better now." Jacob didn't respond right away. He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, his brow furrowed. "It's just, Mom believed in you, even after you left. She used to tell us stories about you. How smart you were, how funny. She said you left because you had dreams, and she wanted us to have dreams too." Ethan's heart ached at the revelation. He hadn't earned Sarah's faith, yet she had held on to it, even in the face of his betrayal. "She shouldn't have had to lie to make us feel better," Jacob continued, his voice quieter now. "But I guess I'm glad she did." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "She wasn't lying, Jacob. I did have dreams, but I went about them the wrong way. I was selfish, and I hurt her. If she told you those stories, it's because she wanted you to see the good in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Jacob glanced at him, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet." Ethan nodded. "That's okay. Take your time. I'll be here, no matter how long it takes." Jacob didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the younger kids chase each other across the grass. Later that evening, as Ethan helped Ruth clean up after dinner, she handed him a folded piece of paper. "Jacob gave this to me a few weeks ago," she said. "I think you should see it." Ethan unfolded the paper, his heart sinking as he read the words scrawled in Jacob's messy handwriting. It was a school assignment, a letter to someone who had hurt him. Jacob had written it to Ethan. "Dear Dad, I don't know why you left, but it hurt. Mom didn't say bad things about you, but I could tell she was sad. I've been mad at you for a long time, and I don't know if I'll ever stop being mad. But maybe, if you stay, I can stop hating you. Maybe." The letter was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. Ethan folded it carefully and placed it on the counter, his hands trembling. "Did he say anything when he gave this to you?" Ruth shook her head. He just said it wasn't finished. Ethan swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. It's a start, he said softly. The weeks that followed brought small but meaningful steps toward healing. Jacob began joining the family for outings more willingly, even cracking the occasional smile when Ethan tried to joke with him. Liam, who had always been quiet, started asking Ethan for help with his schoolwork. Ava continued to brighten every room with her art and laughter, and Ella's trust in Ethan grew stronger with each bedtime story and goodnight hug. One evening, as Ethan tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you going to stay forever?" she asked, her voice filled with childlike sincerity. Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes, Ella, I'm going to stay forever." She smiled and wrapped her small arms around his neck. "I'm glad." As he left her room, he found Jacob standing in the hallway. The boy hesitated, then spoke. "She's starting to believe in you. Don't mess it up." "I won't," Ethan promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Jacob nodded, a flicker of acceptance crossing his face. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And for Ethan, that was enough. Forgiveness was a journey, and he was ready to walk it, no matter how long it took. The sun rose over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Ethan Gray stood in the small kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air as he set plates on the worn table. The apartment was alive with the sounds of morning. Ava's laughter echoing from the bedroom as she playfully argued with Liam about socks, Ella's small feet pattering across the floor, and Jacob's measured, steady movements as he helped Ruth prepare breakfast. It was chaotic, loud, and perfect in its imperfection. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of peace that no boardroom triumph or financial milestone had ever given him. The months since the adoption had been transformative for everyone. Ethan had left behind the corporate world, choosing instead to focus entirely on his family. It had been a difficult decision, but one he never regretted. His mornings were now filled with packing lunches, walking the kids to school, and navigating the complexities of being a father to four very different personalities. It wasn't easy. There were challenges, moments of doubt, and occasional failures. But each day felt like a new beginning, a chance to prove himself to the people who mattered most. Ruth entered the kitchen, her steps slower than they once were, but steady. She carried a tray of toast and scrambled eggs, placing it on the table with practiced efficiency. She glanced at Ethan, her sharp eyes softening slightly. "You're getting the hang of this," she said, nodding at the neatly arranged plates. Ethan smiled. "Thanks. Coming from you. That's high praise." Ruth smirked, but didn't respond. Instead, she called out to the children. "Breakfast is ready. If you don't come now, it's going to the dog." "We don't have a dog," Ava yelled from the hallway, her giggles trailing behind her as she rushed into the kitchen. Liam and Ella followed, their eyes lighting up at the sight of the food. Jacob came in last, his face neutral but his posture more relaxed than it had been in months. The family gathered around the table, the atmosphere warm and lively. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, with the younger children excitedly recounting their plans for the day. Ava chattered about an art contest at school, while Liam shyly mentioned a science project he was working on. Ella, always the youngest and most energetic, shared a story about her teacher's new pet hamster. Ethan listened intently, his heart swelling with pride. He had come to cherish these moments, the shared meals, the laughter, the way the children slowly opened up to him. Even Jacob, though still guarded at times, was beginning to let him in. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Ruth sat on the balcony, watching the children play in the small courtyard below. The sun was warm, casting a golden glow over the scene. Ruth sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the kids as they chased each other around. "You've done well," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan turned to her, surprised. "Thank you," he said, his voice earnest. "That means a lot coming from you." Ruth nodded, her expression contemplative. "I wasn't sure you'd stick around, you know. I thought this would be another one of those things where you try for a while and then give up." Ethan looked down at his hands, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't blame you for thinking that. I wasn't a good man back then, but they've changed me. You've changed me." Ruth's lips curved into a faint smile. "Well, you've earned your place here." They're starting to trust you, even Jacob. That boy's tough, but he's softening. Ethan glanced at Jacob, who was helping Ella climb onto a low wall. The boy's expression was serious, but his actions were gentle and protective. He's a good kid, Ethan said. They all are. I just hope I can be the father they deserve. You're getting there, Ruth said simply. That evening, the family gathered for a small celebration. Ava had won second place in her school's art contest, and Ethan wanted to mark the occasion. He brought home a cake, balloons, and a small gift for her, a set of professional quality paints and brushes. Ava's face lit up when she saw the gift. "Thank you, Dad," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. The word Dad still took Ethan by surprise every time he heard it. It was a title he had never imagined he'd earn, and each time one of the kids said it, it felt like a small miracle. As the evening wore on, the living room filled with laughter and music. Liam showed off a model rocket he had been building for his science project, while Ella danced around with a balloon tied to her wrist. Even Jacob joined in, though he stayed on the edges, watching with a faint smile. Ethan sat back on the couch, taking it all in. This was his family now, messy, chaotic, and full of love. It wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself all those years ago, but it was so much better. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to navigate the ups and downs of fatherhood. There were moments of joy, like teaching Jacob how to change a tire, or helping Ava set up her first online art store. But there were also challenges, like comforting Ella after a bad dream, or helping Liam overcome his fear of public speaking. Through it all, Ethan learned that being a father wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up day after day and being there for the people who needed him. It was about listening, learning, and loving unconditionally. One evening, as he tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He thought for a moment, then smiled. "I'm the happiest I've ever been," he said honestly. Ella beamed, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Me too," she whispered. As he left her room and walked down the hall, he passed Jacob's door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, he could see Jacob sitting at his desk, working on a school assignment. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, then knocked lightly on the door frame. "Come in," Jacob said without looking up. Ethan stepped inside, glancing at the paper spread across the desk. "What are you working on?" "English essay," Jacob replied. "We're supposed to write about someone who's made a difference in our lives." Ethan's heart tightened. "That sounds important." Jacob shrugged. "It's just schoolwork." Ethan nodded, not wanting to push. He turned to leave, but Jacob's voice stopped him. "I was going to write about Mom," he said quietly. "But I think I might write about you." Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned back to Jacob, his eyes searching the boy's face. "I'd be honored," he said softly. Jacob gave a small nod, his gaze dropping back to his paper. "Don't let it go to your head," he muttered, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. Ethan left the room, his chest swelling with emotion. It wasn't a grand declaration of forgiveness, but it was something, a new beginning. The following weekend, the family gathered in the park for a picnic. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly as they played games, shared stories, and enjoyed each other's company. Ruth sat on a blanket, watching with a contented smile as Ethan chased Ella and Liam around the field. Ava sketched the scene in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jacob leaned against a tree, his arms crossed but his face relaxed. As the day wound down, Ethan looked around at his family, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road to this moment had been long and difficult, filled with pain, regret, and uncertainty. But it had also been filled with growth, love, and redemption. This was his new beginning, and he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.